ambition, there was something holy about stillness held for no audience. As the sun moved farther west, its light thinned inside the chamber, crawling slowly down the wall until the floor was lit in a long streak that made the stone look polished, though it was not. Liang stood, not because anything called him to, but because his legs told him it was time to stretch. He moved to the doorway and leaned lightly against the frame, his shoulder pressing into the smooth groove that had been worn there not by his body, but by generations before him, doing the same. Outside, the sky was pale and dry, almost colorless in its clarity, and the edge of the forest below shifted just slightly in the breeze. He spotted no travelers, no birds in flight, no columns of smoke. There was, in fact, absolutely nothing of note, and that was the day's greatest offering. Another afternoon in which no alarm had sounded, no flags had waved, and the great wall remained exactly what it was, a line against the sky, unbroken, enduring, and gently breathing through stone. Returning inside, he filled his kettle for evening tea, though he wouldn't heat it just yet. The act of pouring the water itself was part of the rhythm, something to do, something that made the hours smooth at the edges. He placed the kettle back on its shelf and took a clean cloth to wipe down the table, not because it needed cleaning, but because the cloth wanted motion and the table wanted attention. The movements were slow and circular, not rushed or distracted, but careful, as if each sweep of the hand wrote something into the wood, an invisible sentence about care, or time, or patience. Then he folded the cloth neatly and returned it to the hook where it always hung, watching as it swung once, twice, then came to rest again. Outside, the sun moved lower. Inside, nothing changed. And in that non-change was the meaning of the watchtower, not in battles, not in glory, but in a man walking from wall to ledger to hearth and back again, a man who knew that to hold a space, truly hold it, was to learn to listen to the quiet between each footstep, to know the shape of stillness so well that it never needed filling. Liang breathed in once, long and even, then returned to his mat, hands folded, posture straight, letting the silence speak its usual lines as the afternoon faded into the beginning of another quiet, undisturbed dusk. As the day leaned into its slow descent, the sky above the tower began its shift from bright clarity to a soft dimness that did not so much darken the world as cool it, like a cloth laid gently over a bowl to preserve its contents. Liang stood once more atop the parapet, the wind having picked up only slightly, just enough to lift the worn ends of his robe and flick the corners of the flags in lazy rhythm. The distant mountains, which in the high light of midday had seemed defined and sturdy, were now washed in shades of lavender and gray, their edges dissolving slowly into one another like paint on wet parchment. He took a few steps along the edge, his hands behind his back, his gaze roaming not in search of anything, but as a form of honoring what was there. The cracks in the stone beneath his feet seemed slightly deeper in this lighting, casting faint shadows of their own, and the moss along the lower stones was beginning to glow in the soft light, pale green against aging gray. The wall ahead of him curved gently out of view, like a sentence he had read many times but could not see the end of, and he followed it a short distance pacing its path more from memory than necessity. He could feel the pressure of the air changing, the subtle drop in temperature, the thickening of silence that always came before the evening chorus of insects began. For now, the world held its breath. Liang paused near a bend in the walkway, his hand resting on the top of a stone post, worn smooth by years of wind, and hands before his. A single dry leaf skittered across the ground beside him, carried not by breeze, but by gravity and time, making a faint rustle that broke the stillness only to emphasize it further. He looked upward toward the sky's highest point, now a pale, colorless dome brushed faintly with the first strokes of dusk. No stars yet, only a gradual loss of saturation, as if the world was being carefully lowered into shadow so that none of its edges would be bruised. He exhaled slowly and turned back toward the tower entrance, his footfalls almost inaudible on the stone. Inside, the chamber welcomed him with its usual quiet, a stillness neither oppressive nor lonely, but familiar, like a cloak worn so often that its weight had become indistinguishable from one's own. The fire had not yet been relit, and he did not intend to do so immediately. There was still warmth in the stones, and the air, while cooler, had not crossed into discomfort. He sat near the open window slit, knees drawn up loosely, watching the wall outside grow darker by degrees. He had brought a handful of dried tea leaves to his bowl, letting them sit dry for a while, not yet pouring hot water, just letting them rest, infusing the air faintly with their scent. It reminded him of late autumn, of rice fields after harvest, of clothes dried in the sun and stacked in the wooden chests. These small associations passed through his mind like the breeze, noticeable but fleeting, never held for long. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes briefly, not sleeping, not meditating, just pausing in the perfect stillness of transition. Evening had always been his favorite time in the tower, not because of the beauty, though it was always present, but because of the restraint, the way the wall did not demand anything, only offered its continued presence. When he opened his eyes again, the sky outside had changed further. Now, a deepening grayish blue, it looked like ash, smoothed across the sky's curve. One star flickered in the east, timid at first, then steady. He reached for the kettle and began to heat water for tea, this time using only a few coals to keep the fire small and the light low. He preferred it this way, dim and silent, the shadows flickering against the walls like slow thoughts made visible. As the water heated, he prepared the space for night once more, folding the blanket at the edge of the mat, placing his ledger aside, checking the lantern wick, but not yet lighting it. The day was not over, but it had begun to exhale, and Liang matched its rhythm without resistance. He poured the hot water over the leaves, the steam rising in a curl that caught the dying light. He drank slowly, one sip at a time, both hands around the bowl, allowing the warmth to settle into his chest and drift outward. The taste was faintly bitter, grounding, with notes of dry grass and stone. As he sipped, he watched the tower's shadow retreat into itself, the angles of the chamber softening as light fell away. It was the same every evening, unchanging in its motion, but always new in how it felt. Liang let out a slow breath, finishing the tea, then set the bowl aside, folding his hands in his lap as he listened to the silence grow thicker. The insects had not yet begun their chorus. The wall still held its breath, and for a few more minutes, everything remained still enough to imagine that time had paused here, waiting with him, beneath a sky turning quietly to ash. The dusk deepened, not with haste, but with a measured grace, as though the entire sky had agreed long ago to dim itself in layers, rather than disappear all at once. The horizon, no longer a place where sun and land met, but now a fading seam between cooling air and darkened stone, held on to the final light of the day, like a memory reluctantly released. Liang sat silently in the tower, his back supported by the southern wall, the now cold tea bowl resting beside his foot, forgotten not through neglect, but through immersion in the moment. His eyes were open, not sharply focused on any one thing, but drifting in that soft way that allowed light and shadow to blend into thought. And then, from the far slope beyond the parapet, it came, the first soft chirp of an insect, tentative, unsteady, like a lone musician testing a note in an empty hall. It rang out clearly and briefly, then fell back into stillness, as if waiting for the world's permission to try again. Liang didn't move. He merely listened, his breath slowed, and his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, attuned to the shift that this one sound announced. And indeed, moments later, a second chirp answered, from somewhere closer, followed by a third, then a string of them, hesitant at first, but gathering into a rhythm that gradually built into the low, almost melodic hum of nocturnal life beginning. It was not loud, it was not chaotic. It was a gentle layering of sound across silence, like thin threads stitched into a vast, quiet cloth. He found a comfort in that. How the insects waited until the sun had truly gone. How they understood the pacing of the day better than any man. It meant that the evening had finally settled. The day's business had folded itself away, and the wall had shifted subtly but unmistakably into its nighttime rhythm. Outside, the first star was now visible, not a sharp spark, but a faint glow hovering in the upper east, steady and patient. Liang leaned forward slightly, hands pressed flat to the ground on either side of him, and looked up through the narrow window, slit carved into the wall. He had watched this same star appear on countless evenings, always in the same corner of the sky, always just after the insects began. It was not the brightest or most noticeable, but it was his favorite, if only because of its consistency. It arrived exactly when the tower quieted, as though it knew the rhythm of the stones as intimately as he did. Tonight, like every night, he nodded once in its direction, a small gesture of acknowledgement that required no response. He rose, slowly, knees slightly stiff from sitting too long, and lit the lantern with a single spark struck from flint. The flame grew with a gentle breath, casting golden shadows against the wall and painting his face in soft amber. As he adjusted the wick, he placed it near the entrance, where it would cast a glow down the stone corridor without overwhelming the room. Then, returning to his place, he sat once more on the mat and reached for the folded blanket, not to sleep, but to prepare the space, tucking the corners smoothing the cloth, arranging the edges of his robe so that they draped evenly across his knees. These motions were less about comfort and more about readiness, aligning the body and space with the hour. He did not yet lie down. That moment would come later, when the world outside had turned completely to shadow and the insects no longer seemed like voices, but simply part of the air itself. For now, he sat in that quiet middle between light and dark, between action and stillness. He could smell the faint soot from the lantern, feel the texture of the mat beneath his palms, and hear the soft, rhythmic chirping outside. Closer now, more layered, a background hum that pulsed through the stone walls like the heartbeat of the landscape. He closed his eyes and allowed the sound to fill him. There were no alarms, no tasks left undone, no uncertainty in the air. The tower stood as it always had, silent, watching, breathing in the rhythm of another finished day. Liang was not alone, even in his solitude. He was held by stone and routine, by insect song and distant stars, by the knowledge that tomorrow would begin again, exactly as this one had ended. The wind had softened to little more than suggestion, a faint pressure on the window's edge. Liang sat still a little longer, eyes closed, breath even. In the space between that first star and the full dark, he allowed the world to go quiet around him, as if pausing to listen for something he knew would never come, but that was still worth waiting for. And outside, the insects sang, and the star remained, and the great wall, ancient and unchanged, watched it all without judgment, without need, holding the silence like a secret it had no intention of ever giving away. As night fully settled over the watchtower, Liang remained seated on the mat, his posture calm, the weight of the day gradually softening in his limbs, like sand sinking through water. The lantern's glow had begun to dominate the interior, casting soft, looping shadows that danced across the stone walls in slow, wavering arcs. Every time the flame flickered slightly in response to the faint drafts moving through the arrow slits, the room transformed momentarily. Edges vanished, shapes blurred, and the stone chamber shifted into a quiet play of light and motion, like thoughts rising unbidden in a mind that had long been still. Liang watched it all with gentle eyes, not seeking to control the patterns or interpret their shapes, but merely to witness them, the way one watches clouds change form across an evening sky. The walls that had held firm all day now seemed pliable in this gentle light, no longer stern and immovable, but aged and softened by shadow. Outside, the insect chorus had reached its full rhythm, a layered composition of clicks and hums, trills and pulses that seemed both deeply ancient and always new. He had long stopped noticing individual sounds, and now felt only their combined presence, an ambient current flowing through the night, pressing softly against the outside of the tower like a tide against stone. Occasionally, stronger breeze would send a swirl of air through the narrow window, carrying the faintest hint of pine resin or cool rock, scents that reached the inner chamber like ghostly messengers from the sleeping landscape below. Liang inhaled deeply, letting the breath pass through him without resistance, and closed his eyes, letting his hearing sharpen in the dimness, focusing on the quiet details beneath the more obvious sounds, the small creak of the lantern hook, the occasional shifting of a beam above as it adjusted to the cooling air, the faint rubbing of the wool hem of his robe as it moved slightly with his breath. He shifted his position once, not out of discomfort, but to adjust the way the blanket fell across his lap, and then stilled again, now reclining slightly against the rolled mat he used for back support during the long evenings. He was not tired, not yet. His body knew the exact moment when it would be time to sleep, and that moment had not yet arrived. This was the time for drifting thought, for memory and slow reflection, not with intensity or emotion, but with that flat, steady kind of recall that rises in long silences. He thought of a stone bridge from his youth, curved over a quiet stream, where leaves once gathered in autumn like forgotten prayers. He thought of a broken bowl, once repaired with lacquer, the gold veining its cracked edges still shining faintly in his memory. He thought of a line of poetry, once spoken aloud by a teacher, something about time being both river and mirror. Though the words themselves had faded, these thoughts were not summoned. They rose like the shadows, emerging, shifting, and disappearing again. Liang made no effort to capture or follow them. He let them come and go, as the shadows on the wall did, without resistance or attachment. The quiet in the tower was complete now, not merely an absence of noise, but a fullness of presence. Everything around him, the walls, the mat, the bowl, the folded cloth near the hearth, the faint outline of the ladder leading to the roof, seemed held in a suspended stillness, not frozen, but waiting, as if the entire space had drawn in one long breath and chosen not to let it out just yet. He leaned forward slightly and reached for the kettle, pouring himself the last of the water from earlier, now only lukewarm, and sipped it slowly. The taste was neutral, but even that neutrality had its comfort. It was familiar. It required nothing. He set the cup aside and sat in silence again, allowing the lantern to do what it had always done, burn gently until it did not. In another hour, maybe less, he would extinguish the flame, fold his blanket over himself, and lie down with the stars overhead and the insects below, trusting that nothing urgent would rise in the night, that the wall would remain as it had for generations, watchful, solid, and still. For now, he remained seated, upright but at ease, his gaze unfocused, his mind quiet. There was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to expect. And yet, in that lack of motion, he felt more present than at any other point in the day. The tower didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Its silence was a language all its own, a language he had long since learned to understand without words. Outside, the night deepened further, and the shadows on the walls thickened, curling inward like thoughts folding themselves for sleep. Liang did not move. He did not need to. The shape of thought was enough. The time had come when the lantern's flame grew smaller, not from lack of oil, but as if it too understood that the evening was nearing its end, flickering less out of fatigue and more from a kind of reluctant farewell. Liang sat still before it, legs crossed and hands now resting palm up on his knees, watching the small light cast its final ribbons of glow onto the stone floor which had cooled into a gentle chill beneath him. Outside, the insect chorus had mellowed into a steadier hum, less exploratory now, and more grounded, as though the creatures of the night had each found their place and were simply affirming it in rhythm. The sky beyond the narrow window was fully dark, scattered with a few clear stars that had managed to pierce the slowly thickening clouds drifting in from the west. Liang had noticed them earlier, not storm clouds, just the kind that travel slowly across the night sky without urgency, changing nothing, only adding weight to the air. He leaned forward slowly, his movements unhurried, and blew out the lantern with one soft breath. The flame shrank, shimmered for a heartbeat, then vanished, leaving behind the subtle scent of extinguished oil and warm metal. The darkness took over the room, gently, without violence, like a blanket drawn by a familiar hand. For a few moments, Liang didn't move. He simply allowed the dark to settle around him, his eyes adjusting, not with any rush, but gradually, allowing the outlines of the room to re-emerge in moonlight and instinct. He could still see the shape of the mat, the low shelf against the wall, the empty bowl resting by the hearth's edge, and the pale outline of the ladder leading to the upper platform where the beacon supplies were stored. Not in detail, but in memory, in the gentle awareness of objects long known and never moved. Then, with a breath that was not quite a sigh, he unfolded the blanket and lay down upon the mat, his body settling with the ease of long repetition. The blanket was worn, but thick enough to hold warmth, and he adjusted its corners with the same care he gave every motion in this tower, never hurried, never sloppy, as though even this quiet act of bedding down carried the same quiet dignity as sweeping the floor or logging an entry in the ledger. He folded his arms beneath the cloth, tilted his head slightly toward the window slit, and let his eyes rest half open, gazing not at any one star or pattern, but at the quiet of the sky itself. The world beyond the wall had disappeared into night, but he did not think of what might lie beyond the forest, or the plains, or the rivers. His world ended at the edge of stone, and began again in silence. His ears, no longer distracted by light, began to notice the smaller sounds that had crept into the chamber unnoticed. The slow shifting of wood in the ceiling above, the tiny rustle of fabric against his own breath, the nearly imperceptible patter of dust falling from somewhere unseen, old plaster perhaps, or the soft release of stone shedding its memory. Outside, an owl gave one short cry, and then flew off unseen, its wings silent, but its passing understood. Liang did not rise to look. He had learned long ago that the most faithful way to observe the night was not to chase it, but to remain still and let it come to you. And so, he remained there, eyes now fully closed, his face calm, the quiet pressing gently against his skin like the touch of cool linen. In his mind, the events of the day did not replay themselves in order, nor with clarity. Instead, they returned, like the fading scent of tea leaves in a warmed cup, faint, comforting, and shapeless. The crack in the wall, the brush on the stone floor, the star's first arrival, the silence of the last sip of water. Each small moment no longer stood apart, but flowed together into one unbroken thread of time, woven not for memory, but for peace. Liang's breath grew slower, longer, each exhale drifting upward into the dark like smoke from an invisible fire. He did not speak, nor think of anything beyond this breath, this blanket, this stone, and above him the night remained. The wall stood, the insects sang, the sky darkened further. There was no end to the quiet, only its continuation, as if the very air within the tower had promised to hold everything still until morning. Liang, now fully at rest, did not sleep all at once, but faded gently, as the flame had faded, as the sun had faded, as the light from the ledger ink had dried under his hand. And when sleep came, it was not with dreams or visions, but with the sound of nothing, nothing moving, nothing missing, nothing more to do, only silence, only stone, only one man folded into the watchtower's breath, resting while the wall kept its silent watch through the stars. The midnight hour passed without notice, as it always did, slipping through the tower like a gentle breeze, through a crack in the stone, quiet, unannounced, and unnoticed by anyone awake. For Liang had long since surrendered to the kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from perfect routine, the sort of sleep built layer by layer from repetition and trust. Trust in stone, in silence, in the fact that nothing urgent would demand his attention in the deep hours of the night. Outside, the stars held steady in the ink-dark sky, their patterns ancient and familiar, stretched like frozen whispers across the endless black. The tower stood unmoving beneath them, its shape outlined faintly in moonlight, its stones breathing their own slow rhythm. As the chill of the night deepened, the air had grown colder, not sharply, but gradually, enough to make the moss on the lower walls seem damp, and the corners of the stairway gather small pockets of cool stillness, where the wind curled and settled like a cat preparing to sleep. Inside the chamber, Liang remained wrapped in his blanket, his body still and breath slow, a single quiet presence among stone, shadow, and moonlight. He had shifted once during sleep, turning slightly toward the window slit, his hand resting beneath his cheek, the folds of his robe gathered gently around him like dry leaves at the base of a tree. The fire remained out, the kettle cold, the lantern unlit, and yet nothing felt lacking. The tower did not need flame or voice or motion to be whole. It was complete in its stillness, whole in its quiet. There were no sounds inside except the faintest movements of air and the occasional creak of the wood adjusting to the drop in temperature. From time to time, a single insect still called from the outer ledge, but even these sounds were distant, softened by the hour and muffled by the heavy walls that held the tower's shape. Above, clouds began to drift slowly across the sky, veiling the stars for moments at a time and casting shadows across the courtyard stones below. These clouds were high and thin, like gauze pulled gently over the sky's face, and they moved with such patience that they seemed to slow time itself. Liang, though asleep, was not unfeeling. His breath shifted slightly with the change in air, pressure, a deeper inhale, a looser exhale, as if his body still knew the rhythm of the wall and adjusted to it. Even in dreams, he did not dream of places or people, but if there were dreams, they would have been of stone and wind, of walking slowly along the parapet, of tracing his hand across the top of the wall, of writing a single word into the ledger and then closing the book with care. These were not images that stirred him or broke his rest. They were the very materials of his life, the substance of his waking hours, now folded into the softness of rest. Outside, the valley lay hushed beneath the sky, trees gathered into dark masses of sleeping branches, the river far below, reflecting only the faintest hint of light. No fires burned in the distance, no travelers stirred, no calls echoed between watchtowers. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect silence, the kind that makes even the stones feel more alive. And the great wall, stretching in both directions, beyond the tower, seemed to lean slightly into the quiet, its breath matching that of the man asleep within it. The stones did not shift. The mortar held. The moss clung tightly to its crevices. The world remained as it was, not paused, not frozen, but simply untroubled. Back within the chamber, a faint movement, a rustling of cloth, a change in breath, signaled that Liang's sleep had grown slightly lighter, as if his body sensed the approaching moment when night begins to retreat, when the sky begins its almost imperceptible brightening. He did not open his eyes yet. He lay still, caught between the warmth of rest and the cool awareness of stone beneath him, letting the moment stretch. He felt the blanket's weight, the roughness of the mat beneath his shoulder, the soft pull of fabric across his ankles. There was no alarm, no call to rise, no urgency, just the beginning of another shift in light, another breath from the world outside. The sky, still dark, began to hint at its change, soft silver gathering at its lowest edge, unnoticed by anyone, except perhaps a bird in a high nest or a man who had trained his senses to the movements of light. Liang stirred slightly again, his breath now deeper, more intentional, though his eyes remained closed. He was not yet awake in full, but the sleep had loosened, the deep layers retreating, giving way to the threshold between night and day. And so, in the watchtower, where time moved not by bells or clocks, but by breath, light, and sound, another moment passed without fanfare. Just one more stone, added quietly to the endless structure of hours that made up a life spent in stillness. And watching, Liang stirred at the precise moment when darkness begins to loosen its grip on the world. Not with an alarm, not with any dramatic start, but with the gentle kind of awakening that comes from being so deeply woven into a place that your body and the land seem to share a clock. His eyes opened slowly, not wide, not all at once, just enough to register the faint, silvery blue light pressing in from the slit window, the kind of light that doesn't yet cast shadows, but signals that they are returning. He lay still for a while, his breath even, his limbs relaxed under the blanket, listening not for anyone's sound, but for the absence of disturbance, the comfort of a world still in sleep. The insects had quieted sometime in the deep night, and now only a distant, tentative bird call reached his ears. A single chirp, then silence again, as if the bird too was unsure if it was time to begin. Liang blinked once, then shifted, not rising, but turning onto his side. folding his arms beneath his head and allowing himself one more long breath of stillness before the rituals of the day began again. The stone beneath him had cooled, as it always did by morning, and the air in the room carried a crispness that whispered of dew on moss and chilled wood waiting to be touched. Slowly, deliberately, Liang pushed the blanket aside and sat upright, his robe adjusting with a soft rustle, the quietest of sounds, in a chamber that magnified even the smallest gesture. He did not speak, nor think in words. His mind still held in the space between sleep and alertness, but he felt the familiar grounding of routine begin to settle across his shoulders like a cloak. He rubbed his hands together softly, not for warmth, but to awaken sensation, then reached for the folded cloth he kept near the hearth. Dipping it into the basin of water by the wall, he pressed it to his face, eyes closed, letting the coldness wash the remnants of sleep from his skin. The way wind erases footprints from sand, he stood and stretched, spine crackling faintly, arms extended upward until his fingers brushed the low beam above his head. The movement was less about loosening muscles and more about greeting the space, reminding his body of the height of the room, the weight of air, the reach of the sky just beyond the stone ceiling. He moved next to the kettle, empty from the night before, and refilled it from the large clay jug tucked in the corner. The water poured with a soft, hollow glug, echoing gently in the quiet chamber. Liang placed the kettle on its stand above the hearth, where a few coals from the previous day had been saved under ash. He stirred them gently with an iron rod, coaxing them to life, feeding them with a twist of dry kindling, until the faint orange glow pulsed to readiness. The fire rose not in a rush, but in a slow spiral, like a yawn stretched across stone. As the water began its slow heating, Liang opened the narrow window's shutter fully for the first time that day. The world outside had begun to define itself, a soft mist hanging over the valley, trees appearing more as outlines than forms, the sky streaked with pale lavender and the faintest blush of rose. The mountains to the north were still dark silhouettes, unmoved and unimpressed by the shifting sky, while the line of the wall leading westward remained in half shadow, its stone catching just enough light to whisper its shape to the world. Liang breathed in the cold morning air, wet with dew, faintly earthy, and edged with the smell of stone, and let it settle in his lungs like a tonic. He leaned against the sill, arms crossed, eyes following a single bird as it flitted from the wall's edge to a distant tree, vanishing into the gray-green fog. Behind him, the kettle let out a quiet rattle. The water nearly ready, he returned to it, removed it from the flame, and poured it slowly over a small pinch of tea leaves, resting in his bowl. The steam rose steadily, curling into the cool air, filling the room with a scent that was as much memory as aroma, bitter, earthy, with a trace of smoke. He cupped the bowl in both hands and took the first sip, standing, letting the warmth ease into his body like sunlight through a thick robe. There was no need for words, no desire for thought, just the quiet presence of this moment, the soft glow of firelight, the slow bloom of morning through stone, the warmth of tea, and the whisper of the wall outside slowly returning to itself. And so began another day, not with sound or surprise, but with the careful unfolding of tasks so familiar they had become part of his being, part of his being. Liang did not speak. He did not rush. He drank his tea, returned the bowl to its place, and moved to sweep the chamber floor, as he always did, each motion slow, precise, and full of a reverence that was never spoken aloud. The dust collected into small patterns, as it did every morning, and was swept into the same corner where it would be gathered later. The coals were rearranged, the cloth was folded again, the kettle was emptied and wiped clean, and as the sun finally crested the far ridge and spilled its light through the window, Liang stood once more in the center of the tower, quiet and still, his day already begun in the way he liked best, not with urgency, but with awareness, as the first full beam of sunlight reached across the threshold and touched the chamber's floor. The tower seemed to exhale, not with sound or shift, but with a visible ease, a long-held breath being released into the morning. Liang stood near the eastern wall, watching the shape of light as it stretched gradually across the stone, illuminating the edges of the room, not all at once, but inch by inch, like a slow unfurling of some ancient scroll. The golden warmth struck the shelf where the ledger rested, catching on the grain of its wooden cover, before crawling toward the hearth, where soot still outlined the shape of yesterday's fire. Everything looked softer in that moment, not because the light was dim, but because it was honest. This was not the harsh light of noon, nor the romantic dimness of dusk, but the clarity of morning that reveals what is, without judgment, without flattery. Liang moved slowly, careful not to interrupt the light's progress. As if walking beside a sleeping companion, he resumed his routine with the silent familiarity of someone who had repeated it more times than he could count, not out of obligation, but because it was his way of greeting the day. He fetched the small brush broom from its hook and began sweeping the corners, the soft bristles catching dust and fallen flecks of old mortar that the night's cooling had loosened. There was no rush. Each stroke was long, steady, deliberate, creating small furrows in the film of time that lay across the floor. The sound was barely audible over the quiet, a faint brushing that seemed to blend with the wind slipping in from the arrow slit, carrying with it the scent of pine and cool air rising from shaded stones below. Liang's back was straight, his shoulders relaxed, his face neutral, not stern, not smiling, simply present. Once the floor was cleared, and the gathered dust swept carefully into a small clay dish by the door, Liang returned the broom to its hook and stood still for a moment, his hands resting against the stone ledge. Outside, the morning had sharpened. The valley was now visible in full, its trees no longer shadows, but distinct forms swaying ever so slightly with the breeze. The birds had begun their calls in earnest now, a conversation without direction, but full of certainty. Somewhere in the distance, a second watchtower could be seen through the haze, just a stub of structure on a far rise, its details blurred by the distance, but its presence unmistakable. Liang gave it a small nod, though he knew no one would see him. It was not a greeting to a fellow man, but to the shared duty that stretched between towers, across ridges, through time. He returned inside and took a moment to inspect the ledger. Though it was still early, he always checked its condition, before making the first entry. The ink from yesterday had dried to a faded sheen, the characters steady and exact as they had been written. He ran one finger lightly across the edge of the page, feeling the faint rise of the brush strokes, then closed the cover gently. He would write again soon, but not yet. There was still time for observation, for stillness, for letting the day reveal itself before he attempted to describe it. He sat by the open window, slid again, resting his arms on the cool stone, eyes blinking slowly in the brightness. He watched a hawk circle far above the trees, its wings stretched silent and wide, gliding in lazy loops that traced invisible paths across the open sky. It was not hunting, not yet, just flying for the sake of flight. The sun rose further, spilling warmth into the tower, heating the stone beneath Liang's feet, chasing away the final chill that had lingered since before dawn. He could feel the difference in the air, not just in temperature, but in texture, less brittle now, more fluid, as though the day had finally taken shape and decided to remain. Liang lifted the kettle, still cool from earlier, and considered reheating it, then decided against it. He was not yet ready for more tea. The first cup had done what it needed to do, and now he preferred the quiet that followed. Instead, he stood again and walked to the small table near the western wall, where he kept a few folded maps and scraps of parchment. He unrolled one, not to study it, but simply to look. The wall's path meandered across mountains and valleys like a stitched seam, steady and winding, eternal in its motion. He looked at it for a while, then rolled it up and tied the simple string around it again, placing it back with the others. He was not planning anything. There were no battles, no travelers, no messages today. But still, he liked to hold the shape of the wall in his mind, the same way a fisherman remembers the shape of a river, even when he is not casting a line. These were the contours of his world, and to trace them with the eye was to honor their presence. The light now reached the far wall, the last shadow tucked into the corner, disappearing under the day's full command. Liang returned to the center of the room, standing tall, breathing slowly, letting the moment expand. Nothing urgent awaited him. Nothing would change quickly. But still, the day had begun again, and the wall, patient and vast, would bear witness. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to cast distinct shadows along the length of the parapet, long angular streaks that shifted slowly with the arc of the sky, and the warmth had spread evenly across the watchtower's walls, soaking into the stone and seeping gently into the bones of the structure. Liang had made his way back to the outer ledge after completing his interior routines, his body moving with the slow, measured rhythm that only years of repetition could teach, a kind of quiet choreography between man and place, where every footstep was placed not for speed, but for continuity. He walked the upper walkway with steady, even pacing, pausing at familiar points, not because anything required his attention, but because his body remembered to pause there, remembered the views, the patterns in the valley below, the way the wall curved gently westward like a sleeping dragon's back. There was a soft breeze brushing across his cheeks, barely enough to move the fabric of his robe, but just strong enough to lift the scent of earth and distant pine. the freshness of a sun-warmed world, slowly waking to itself. The forest below, once hidden in shadow, now shimmered slightly in the heat. A sea of green, shifting under the weight of wind and light. Insects drifted lazily through the air, tiny glints of life that flickered past like dust caught in a sunbeam. Liang leaned against the stone railing at one of the northern points, where a small outcropping of the wall gave him a clear view of the mountains in the far distance. They looked blue at this hour, not from sky, but from their own distance, faded by morning haze, softened like painted brush strokes on a silk scroll. He didn't need to be on watch, not now, not exactly. There had been no signals from other towers, no changes in smoke patterns, no echo of hoofbeats or distant horns. But this too was part of the rhythm, to be present even in stillness, to watch, not because something might happen, but because nothing was happening. That, after all, was the true success of the wall. Peace was its quiet triumph. A day like this, where the valley slept and the sky remained unbroken, was what centuries of hands had stacked stone to protect. Liang knew this and understood his part within it. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to witness, and in witnessing, he upheld the purpose of every craftsman, farmer, soldier, and emperor whose will had poured into these stones. He took a small step backward and sat down on the low bench near the corner tower where signal flags were stored, though he had no intention of using them. The bench was worn smooth from long use, its wood bleached and splinterless, and Liang adjusted his robe beneath him as he sat, folding his hands in his lap and allowing his posture to soften slightly. The warmth of the sun settled across his back like a familiar hand, and he tilted his face toward it, eyes closed, breathing through his nose with slow, quiet ease. He could hear the soft buzzing of a fly somewhere behind him, the rustling of distant birds in the trees below, and the faint whistling of the wind winding its way between parapets. None of the sounds demanded anything. They simply were, part of the great stillness that surrounded him, like water surrounding a boat at anchor. His thoughts wandered, as they often did at this hour, but never far. They lingered on images rather than words. The curve of the path leading down the slope, the way the sun had lit the far side of the wall yesterday at this time, the taste of the tea from earlier, faint and a little earthy. He remembered the quiet snort of a passing mule 2 summers ago, led by a traveling merchant who had stopped at the tower for half an hour and offered dried apricots in trade for water. He thought about the cracked edge of the ledge where his foot now rested, where a lightning strike had once split the stone, in a storm so long ago that the sky had forgotten the sound of it. These were not traumatic thoughts, not visions or epiphanies, just the quiet stitching together of 1 hour to the next, 1 day to the next, in a life measured not by events, but by presence. Liang eventually stood, not because he had to, but because his legs asked for it. He brushed the dust from his robe and made his way slowly back toward the main entry, pausing at each tower slit to glance down the outer face of the wall, as if confirming that the world was still intact, that the same trees still swayed, that the same river still curled through the valley like a sleeping ribbon of glass. Everything was in place. The wall was unchanged. The sun moved, but the stones held. And so, with nothing to correct or inspect or announce, he returned inside and allowed the door to close softly behind him. The sound, a low thud that echoed briefly before fading into the ambient hush. Back inside, the chamber had fully embraced the light of day, no longer golden, but now soft and white, like milk poured across stone. Liang crossed the room with bare footsteps, returning to the table and the blank ledger page he had left untouched earlier. He dipped the brush in ink with slow circular motions and paused before writing, allowing the morning to settle fully into his body. Then, with precise and unhurried movements, he wrote the date and a single line beneath it. Mid-morning, no clouds, no wind, all remains quiet. He did not need to say more. The silence said it all. By the time the sun had moved past its morning angle and begun its slow climb toward the steep noon, a mild breeze had returned to the tower, not strong or intrusive, but persistent enough to find its way through every narrow slit and gap between the stones, as though it too had walked this path countless times and knew exactly where to press its cool fingers. Liang, now sitting just inside the open doorway, let the wind wrap around him like a whisper, eyes half-lidded and fixed somewhere beyond the parapet. It wasn't the sort of breeze that startled or refreshed. It was the kind that kept company, carrying the scent of distant pine bark, dry grass warmed under sun, and a faint trace of river silt that must have traveled upward from the valley below. He didn't speak, but the wind filled the silence like an old friend who needed no greeting. The light had turned brighter now, the kind of overhead glow that smoothed every shadow into something shallow and temporary. In this noon-like stillness, everything felt slower, not because the day had grown heavy, but because there was nowhere for the hour to go. Liang's shadow was short, folded beneath him, nearly lost against the sun-bleached stone. He sat with one knee raised, arms resting loosely, and his thoughts meandered as the wind moved around his neck and tugged gently at the edge of his robe. Across from him, in the far corner of the chamber, the brush he had used earlier swayed just slightly on its hook, moving in time with the shifting air, as though it were nodding in agreement with a thought no one had spoken aloud. He shifted his weight slightly and leaned back against the frame, letting the warmth of the sunlit wall behind him press into his shoulder blades. Though the tower was made entirely of stone, sun-warmed sections like this carried a comfort that felt more human than structural. Liang closed his eyes for a few moments and listened, not for warning or signs, but just to listen. The wind made a low, fluttering hum where it passed through a small break in the upper beam, a sound so constant that it had, over time, become a kind of language. He had come to know the difference between an eastward pull and a westward sigh, between a breeze passing over dry leaves and one that had kissed water. There were voices in the air, he believed. Not spirits, perhaps, but memories, echoes of those who had stood here before him, breathed this same air, watched these same hills. Opening his eyes again, Liang let his gaze drift toward the far horizon. It was hazy now, not from storm or fire, but from the sheer intensity of light. The air shimmered faintly above the stone path, as it curved downward into the valley, and beyond it, the landscape softened into a watercolor of green and brown, line and blur. Farther still, mountains rose like folded fabric, steady and patient. The great wall disappeared and reappeared between them, not as a symbol or a boundary, but as a fact, something that simply was, like the sky or the shape of the land. He ran one hand across the smooth ledge beside him, the surface warm and dusty, its edge worn from decades, perhaps centuries, of quiet use. Every nick, every chip, every soft depression was a kind of story, too slow to tell in words, but present all the same. A soft clatter behind him made him glance toward the interior wall, where a tiny piece of parchment, unstuck from the shelf where it had rested, had fluttered to the ground. It hadn't been important, just a torn note he'd used once as a placeholder in an old scroll. But the way it had moved reminded him how even the most forgettable objects carried life when, stirred by the wind. He stood, stretched his arms above his head with a slow inhale, then walked across the chamber and retrieved the parchment, smoothing it once before placing it under a small stone on the shelf. It was a small task, but it felt right. Another quiet ritual in a day filled with them. He walked a slow loop around the room, fingers trailing gently along the stone as he passed. Then he returned to the open doorway, this time standing at its center, letting the full width of light pour over his face. He closed his eyes again, not from tiredness, but to feel the balance of warm light and cool air, of sun on his skin and wind in his sleeves. It was a stillness earned, not gifted, a stillness maintained by 100 unseen choices, by keeping watch even when nothing asked to be seen. And so he stood, silent and complete, a man not waiting for change, but making peace with its absence. The wind continued its passage through the tower, brushing past him, circling the room, slipping into the crevices of stone and memory alike. Liang smiled, just faintly, almost imperceptibly, and for a moment it felt as if the wind smiled back. Noon itself arrived not like a bell toll or a mark upon the sky, but as a stillness so complete that even the wind, ever a gentle companion throughout the morning, seemed to pause in its journey, resting somewhere just beyond the reach of the watchtower. The air grew heavier, not in burden, but in warmth, the kind of deep, dry heat that settles on the stone and turns it into a silent hearth. Liang remained inside the main chamber now, seated cross-legged beside the ledger, not writing, but simply resting his palm on its cover, as if keeping company with the day's record without the need for ink or brush. The sun, now at its highest, poured in through the slits and narrow windows, at angles that cut bright geometric paths across the floor, hard edges of light carving through the gentle dust that floated, barely visible, like old breath suspended in space. The shadows were shortest now, everything exposed for what it was, without room for illusion or softness. Liang did not resist the heat. He let it soak into his limbs and bones, grounding him more deeply into the stone beneath him. His robe, though light and simple, clung slightly where sweat had begun to rise along his back and under his arms. But even this, he welcomed. It was the body's acknowledgement of the sun's rule over the hour, just as the insects acknowledge dusk and the stars responded to night. The kettle sat unused on the hearth. The fire had been left to burn itself out earlier in the morning, and Liang had not fed it since. There was no need for tea now, only stillness. The room, despite the brightness outside, remained dim and calm, a cool retreat with thick walls that seemed to hold a memory of morning shadows, just long enough to outlast the sun's peak. Occasionally, a single note from a bird drifted in from the outer world, faint, solitary, as if even the creatures of the forest knew better than to sing at full volume in such an hour. He adjusted his sitting posture, shifting to relieve a small ache in his left leg, and rolled his shoulders once, slowly, the motion cracking faintly in the heavy air. He let his hand slide from the top of the ledger and onto his lap, breathing steadily and with control, his eyes focused on the far wall, though he wasn't truly seeing it. This part of the day was not for activity or analysis. It was for resting while awake, for existing in full awareness of the present without asking anything more from it. Liang's thoughts, such as they were, flowed without urgency. He remembered the taste of a salt-preserved plum he'd once eaten during a summer not unlike this one. He pictured the feel of his mother's sleeve brushing against his cheek when he was a child sitting beside her on a quiet afternoon like this. These thoughts were not nostalgic, not longing. They simply were part of the still pulse of the moment. Beyond the walls, the land stretched in all directions under the full authority of the sun. The forest below seemed to shimmer slightly at its edges, not from movement, but from the heat's distortion. The stones of the wall glowed in silence, their surfaces absorbing and releasing warmth in alternating waves, like sleeping dragons beneath pale skin. Insects remained low to the ground, or vanished into shaded places, and even the birds had taken to perches deep within foliage, where sunlight could not quite reach. The entire world, it seemed, had agreed upon a collective breath, long, deep, and shared. Liang could feel that breath even here, in the chamber's center, where air did not stir, but still carried weight. He allowed himself to lie back slowly, easing onto the mat with practiced grace, folding his hands over his stomach and gazing up at the ceiling beams, where faint traces of soot marked years of lantern smoke, rising and disappearing. The tower creaked once, a low, stretched groan from a timber beam overhead, followed by a stillness again. Liang blinked slowly. He counted his breaths, not to achieve anything, but because it pleased him to know that even in this unmoving world, something rhythmic remained. 10 breaths passed, then 20. A faint gust of wind teased the edge of the slit window, but did not enter. The light shifted again, almost imperceptibly, and he knew the hour had begun to turn. Noon, like everything else, did not stay. It passed just as silently as it had arrived, melting into the slow drift of early afternoon. Still lying there, Liang closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting his consciousness hover on the edge of rest. He would not sleep, not now, but this brief closing of the eyes was his offering to the sun, his moment of trust that the world could carry itself without his eyes upon it. Then, without any sound or sign, he opened them again. adjusted his robe, and slowly sat upright, palms pressing against the mat to steady himself. He reached for the ledger, this time lifting it with intention, and drew the inkstone near. The brush moved across the page with careful ease, the strokes precise and fluid. Midday, sun strong, no activity, all remains calm. He paused, then added, wind light, stone warm, no disturbances. He let the brush rest a moment in his hand, hovering above the ink, and considered a final line. After a breath, he wrote, stillness continues, and with that, the record was done. As the sun began its slow descent past the zenith, the angle of light shifted once more, casting longer shadows that crept up the walls of the watchtower like time reasserting itself after a long pause. The change was so gradual that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not attuned to it. But Liang felt it in the subtle cooling of the air near the stone floor, in the shift of brightness on the interior walls, and in the way the dust motes caught the sunlight differently, less like stars, more like drifting embers. He stood from the mat, brushing the folds of his robe smooth with practiced hands, and walked with soft steps to the outer doorway, where the heat had softened and the wind had returned, weaving lightly through the crevices in the stones with a kind of thoughtful deliberation. Afternoon was not a time of action here, but one of preparation, not for something dramatic, but simply for the slow retreat of the day's energy, for the folding of light and routine into the long arms of evening. Leaning against the sun-warmed stone of the parapet, Liang looked outward at the landscape that now wore a different face. The forest below was no longer blazing with color, but instead wore a dusty green, its edges touched with golden highlights. Birds had returned to movement, darting between branches in short, swift lines, their chirps higher pitched now, more awake than before. In the far west, clouds began to form low on the horizon, small and slow-moving, like thoughtful animals gathering before dusk. There was no threat in them, only the suggestion of evening coolness and the quiet hush that would soon fall across the ridgelines. Liang followed the line of the wall with his eyes, tracing its gentle curves as it flowed up and down the hills like a great stone ribbon. From this vantage point, he could almost feel the presence of the other towers, not by sight alone, but as a shared silence, like pauses in a long song that needed no instrument. He turned slightly and took a seat on the small stool near the outer ledge, where he sometimes repaired tools or sorted small supplies, though today he did neither. Instead, he simply sat and allowed the moment to expand, his back straight, hands folded, chin lifted slightly in contemplation. From this angle, the sun's light reached only the edge of the tower's face, casting the rest in a soft, forgiving shade. The wind stirred his sleeves now and then, pulling gently, as if asking nothing in particular, just offering presence. A lone hawk circled above, its shape black against the pale blue, rising and dipping on invisible currents. Liang followed its movement with slow blinks, not expecting anything from it, simply witnessing it as part of the rhythm of the hour. Inside, the chamber remained undisturbed, though shadows had begun to pool at its corners again, darkening slightly with every passing moment. The fire had not been lit again. There was no tea prepared, No new entries needed in the ledger. Liang remained in his quiet vigil, watching the hour unfold with the same care one might give to the turning of pages in a cherished book. No rush, no skipping ahead, just the quiet satisfaction of each small detail. The warmth from earlier had not disappeared, but now layered itself gently under the surface of the stone, like a held breath waiting to be exhaled. Even the insects had adjusted their pitch, their tiny wing beats rising slightly in tone as the sunlight softened. A soft creaking sound came from above. Perhaps the old wood of the signal platform adjusting to the cooler air, or a loosened stone nudged by a persistent gust. Liang did not react with alarm. These sounds were expected, welcomed even, reminders that the tower lived in its own way, murmuring in response to time and weather. He reached into the fold of his robe and pulled out a single piece of dried fruit, an apricot from the small ration stored in a wooden box near the supply shelf, and bit into it slowly. The taste was sharp at first, then mellowed, the sweetness modest, but satisfying. It was one of the few indulgences he allowed himself during the day, and it marked, in its own way, the passage from the energy of morning into the softness of late afternoon. Finishing the fruit, he brushed his hands together once, scattering the smallest crumbs to the wind, and stood again, walking once more along the outer wall. He paused at each narrow slit to glance through it, not to search for anything in particular, but because these small rituals anchored him in time. Each look affirmed that the world outside remained still, that the line between inside and outside was clear, that the wall continued to hold. The valley, now bathed in slanted gold, seemed to hum with warmth, even as the air cooled slightly. In the far trees, shadows stretched sideways. The river below caught the light like a thread of silk, drawn taut between hills. Liang made his way back to the chamber slowly, hands trailing along the stone as he walked. He crossed the threshold and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust once more to the changing interior light, then moved to the ledger, opened it gently, and added only a single line: afternoon clear, light fading, wall steady. Then he closed it again, pressing his palm briefly to the cover before stepping back. There was still time in the day, still more quiet to tend to, but for now, he simply stood there, wrapped in the layered silence of stone, sun, and shadow. As the hour tilted ever so gently toward evening, as the sun bent lower in the sky and began to drape its amber light across the long spine of the great wall, the tower entered its most tender hour, a time when everything softened without vanishing, when every angle of stone and wood grew rounder in the slanted glow, and even Liang's quiet movements seemed to hum with the hush of approaching dusk. He stood at the narrow window on the western side, resting one elbow along the ledge, his face half lit by the warm, golden wash of sun that poured through like liquid, casting a shimmer on the far wall and turning dust motes into specks of fire. The world outside stretched long in shadow, trees extending their silhouettes like reaching fingers, hilltops edged in glowing orange, and the river now darkened along one bank, as if it too were seeking cover for the night. Liang's gaze swept the horizon slowly, not scanning, not searching, but receiving. There was something about this time of day, that asked for reverence, not in prayer or posture, but in attention, in stillness, in full-bodied acknowledgement of the world as it turned gently toward rest. The breeze returned, now cooler, now speaking in longer sighs that curled through the stone slits and lifted the corners of his robe. It carried with it the scent of turned earth, of sun-warmed pine giving way to shadow, and somewhere, very faintly, the trace of cooking smoke, perhaps from a distant outpost or from shepherds, settled in a low valley below. The sense did not stir hunger in Liang, but recognition. These were the smells of evening, the same every day, yet never tiresome. He stepped back from the ledge and walked to the outer platform that jutted out like a quiet stage from the tower, where a signaling flag hung furled and untouched, the cloth heavy and at rest. He stood in full light now, allowing the last heat of the sun to rest against his shoulders, and closed his eyes for a moment, not out of fatigue, but in silent welcome to this last offering of day. His breathing deepened. The warmth on his skin was not like midday's sharp insistence. It was generous, wrapping around him like the last embrace of something beloved before parting. He did not speak. No thoughts interrupted the hour. Even the hawk that had circled earlier now drifted somewhere beyond the edge of sight, and the insects had lowered their hum to something more grounded and steady. Liang turned, tracing the edge of the platform with his fingers, pausing to feel the grooves in the stone where centuries of feet had passed, each leaving behind some unseen part of themselves, steps absorbed by time. The surface was worn, slightly curved by the rhythm of repetition, and under his palm it felt like a memory, tangible and absolute. He stepped back inside, his feet padding lightly against the stone floor. The interior of the tower had grown dimmer now, though the golden light still reached through the slits and landed in angled bars across the floor and walls. One such beam illuminated the brush and inkstone, waiting near the ledger. Liang did not move toward it, yet. Instead, he sat cross-legged in the fading light, letting his mind catch up to the hour, letting the moment lengthen. This was not the same stillness as morning, nor the heavy pause of noon. It was a gentler kind, laced with closure, with the sense that nothing more was needed. He let his eyes follow the shifting light across the stones, watching it travel, watching it vanish slowly in layers, until only a faint golden trace remained. In time, he rose again, brushing his robe smooth and walking without urgency to the small shelf where a folded cloth sat. With care, he dipped it in cool water and wiped his hands and neck, the dampness refreshing in its simplicity. The act was ceremonial in its own right, a preparation not for sleep, but for the winding down of presence, for letting the day fall away piece by piece, till only breath and shadow remained. He refolded the cloth and placed it precisely where it had been, then returned to the table, took up the brush, and dipped it slowly into ink. The paper welcomed him. His strokes were even and unhurried, sun lowering, light soft and long, no sign from the west. All paths remained clear. He paused, the brush hovering slightly, then continued. Evening comes gently, wind cool, stones hold warmth. He drew a final line, straight, calm, steady, and let the brush rest. Outside, the sky had shifted into its next shape. No longer gold, but copper and rose, then violet at the farthest edges. Liang stepped outside once more, watching as the wall glowed faintly with all the colors it had absorbed over the course of the day, now returning them to the sky like quiet thanks. He stood in stillness, feeling the balance of cool air and warm stone beneath his feet. And for a moment, he felt not like a single man in a solitary tower, but like a single note in a vast and perfect song, one that had been playing long before him and would continue long after. The wind moved past his cheek like a whispered promise. He did not reply. He simply stayed. The day's final descent began not with a shout, but with a sigh, the soft exhale of sunlight as it retreated behind the mountains, casting the world in a veil of shadow that arrived slowly, respectfully, as if unwilling to interrupt the stillness it had helped create. Liang stood beside the window slit, facing west, where the sky, only moments ago, adorned in ribbons of amber and rose, now turned toward a deeper indigo, blending at the edges with the gray silhouettes of hills, grown more secretive by the minute. The tower's stones, which had basked in the heat and brightness for hours, began to lose their glow, becoming cool underfoot and ghostly in the shifting light. Liang traced the edge of the window's stone frame with one finger, his skin meeting rough, time-worn texture, while his eyes followed the horizon line until the final trace of the sun vanished beneath it, an old friend quietly excusing itself. From the gathering, the wind had changed. It was not stronger or colder, but quieter, less interested in conversation now, more reflective, as if carrying away the day's stories whispered across the wall. Liang listened to it brush past the tower's outer face, a low murmuring presence slipping through narrow paths in the stone. Birds had grown silent. The insects, too, had lowered their tune, though not to nothing, just to a hum, low enough to match the dimming of the world. The shadows in the chamber grew fuller, pooling in corners and stretching outward like ink spilled in slow motion. Liang turned from the window and lit a single lantern with flint and practiced ease, cupping his hand around the flame until it caught, then setting it on the table near the ledger. The glow was gentle, amber, and flickering, casting soft shadows that danced against the stone with the grace of old rituals performed 1,000 times before. He moved about the room with care, folding away the day with gestures that were both deliberate and deeply ingrained. The kettle was cleaned and placed back on its shelf, though unused for hours. A wooden bowl was checked, its contents still sealed and dry. A small tool, used for scraping debris from between stones, was returned to its drawer with the quiet click of wood on wood. He swept the same places he had swept at dawn, not because they needed it, but because the act was a bookend, a reminder that the circle of the day had completed its arc. Outside, the stone wall that stretched westward faded into darkness, no longer visible in its full form, but sensed, still there, felt like a deep breath in the chest, even when unseen. Liang stepped outside for a final look before true night took hold, resting his hands lightly on the parapet, feeling the drop in temperature across the stone, like an invisible tide rolling over his knuckles. The stars were coming out, timidly, at first, one here, another there, until the sky began to shimmer in quiet defiance of the days fading. A pale crescent moon hovered low over the distant hills, a smile in profile, not yet bright, but confident in its ascent. Liang watched the heavens for a long moment, not for guidance, not for omens, but for the sheer practice of noticing. He had long since ceased assigning meaning to such things. The stars would rise, whether or not he stood here, and that was their beauty. They expected nothing, asked for no witness, offered no promise. They were, and that was enough. A cool gust passed, and Liang pulled his robe tighter across his chest, not against the chill, but as a gesture of closure, a drawing in of the self toward the center, where warmth and thought lingered. When he returned to the chamber, the lantern's glow felt warmer by contrast, a hearth of stillness in a sea of cooling stone. He sat beside it, rubbing his hands together, not for comfort, but for presence, the soft rasp of skin on skin reminding him that time continued in small, tangible ways. He opened the ledger one final time and dipped the brush in ink, the bristles silent as they soaked up the black. His handwriting remained steady, practiced. Sunset passed, stars arriving, all remained still. No travelers, no lights on distant paths. Wind settled, stones resting. He paused, not because he didn't know what to write next, but because he felt it must be earned. Then, with soft certainty, he added, "The wall breathes with the dark, and I remain." He closed the ledger and pressed his palm once more against its surface, letting the ink dry under the warmth of his hand. The tower, now fully cloaked in night, felt neither lonely nor forgotten. It stood as it always had, watching, waiting, keeping a silence that stretched far beyond its own shape. Liang sat with his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the lantern, shoulders softened, thoughts stilled. Outside, the great wall ran off into the dark, like the spine of a slumbering earth. And above it, stars blinked into fullness, one by one, saying nothing, asking nothing. The hour made no noise. It simply settled itself, like dust, like breath, like the final page of a book, closed without hurry, and in that quiet, Liang let himself begin to rest, not with the finality of sleep, but with the calm that comes from having watched a whole day pass without needing to change a thing. As night fully settled upon the mountains and the valleys below, the great wall slipped into its darker form, not vanished, not diminished, but simply cloaked in a quiet that only the absence of light can bestow. The sky above was now a vast velvet dome, scattered with pinpricks of starlight, their flicker slow and lazy, like ancient thoughts drifting in no particular direction. Liang sat near the window slit, the lantern behind him casting just enough glow to silhouette his form, leaving his face in gentle shadow, his features smoothed by the absence of detail. He did not move much, nor did he need to. The day's final responsibilities had passed with the setting of the sun, and the tower, like himself, was now in its contemplative phase, still awake, still aware, but without the urgency or pace that marked daylight hours. The cool of night had deepened, and with it came the subtle creaks and groans of the old structure easing into rest, wooden beams shifting slightly, stone joints exhaling with the temperature change. the wind no longer active, but thoughtful, pressing occasionally against the tower as if to make sure it was still there. The silence was not complete, but it was encompassing, the kind that drew every small sound into focus. A faint rustle near the corner of the room as a lizard repositioned itself in a crack between stones. The soft clink of the ink bottle's stopper settling more deeply into place after the air cooled, and the distant bark of a wild dog echoing faintly from the valley floor. None of it urgent, none of it disturbing, just the night reminding Liang that the world, though quieter, was still alive. He rose after a long stillness and moved across the room with deliberate care, lifting the lantern and carrying it to the far side of the chamber. Its flame bounced shadows across the walls, throwing slow arcs that followed his motion like the pendulum of a clock, marking time not with sound, but with shifting glow. He set it down upon a narrow ledge and checked the oil, adding a few careful drops from the small gourd that hung nearby. The wick soaked it up without resistance, and the flame fluttered once in gratitude before settling back to its steady posture. Liang sat once more, not in the chair, but directly on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting lightly on his knees. This was a posture he knew well. Not meditation exactly, but a way of anchoring himself in the present, of letting the hours unfold without the pressure to interpret them. Outside, the moon had risen high enough to cast its pale light across the ridges, revealing the serpentine line of the wall in silver fragments. The stones reflected the moonlight, not brightly, but softly, like memory, hints of shape and distance, contours remembered rather than seen. The towers along the wall stood like ancient sentinels, quiet and motionless, their presence known only by the way the stars disappeared briefly behind them before returning. Liang imagined the men in those towers, each in their own posture of waiting or resting, each held by the same hush that cradled him now. No signal fires were lit tonight, no flags waved. It was a night without message, and that, in its own way, was the most reassuring message of all. He picked up the ledger again, not to write, but to hold, feeling the grain of the cover beneath. His fingers, the slight curve at the edges, worn smooth by days, just like this. He thought about the other entries, the small, quiet moments captured in brush strokes, the proof that life continued even when nothing dramatic occurred. His hand hovered above the blank page, brush and fingers, and then, with simple strokes, he added the day's final line. The wall holds. The night is calm. I remain. He let the ink drop before closing the ledger gently, then placed it back on the low table with care, its presence like a finished thought resting in the room. The wind touched the slit window again, bringing with it a faint scent of cold stone and dry grass. Liang wrapped his robe more tightly around his shoulders, not shivering, but settling in, as one does before a long and peaceful silence. He leaned his head back against the wall and gazed upward, where a small slice of stars was visible from his position, constellations he had no names for, yet had watched for years. They were the same shapes he had seen the season before, and the year before that, and likely the same ones, watched by those who had stood in this tower long before his birth. They offered no advice, no certainty, just presence. And sometimes presence was enough. The hour grew deeper. The light from the lantern began to lose its strength, flickering now and then as oil receded into the wick. Liang did not rise to tend it again. Let it go, he thought. Let the darkness come. It was not a darkness to fear, but one to join. The world outside no longer held shape, only impression, and the tower, solid and breathing, seemed to pulse with quiet life of its own. In this moment, there was no schedule, no duty, no voice except the whisper of night and the soft rhythm of breath within stone walls. And so, beneath that velvet sky, with the great wall stretched out like a sleeping beast beneath the stars, Liang closed his eyes, not to sleep yet, but to rest his seeing, and gave himself, without resistance, to the stillness. As the moon crept higher and carved a wider swath across the blackness above, the watchtower felt as though it had become part of the night itself, no longer a structure separate from its surroundings, but a settled breath within the greater chest of the land. Liang remained seated, his back cushioned by folded robes, arms crossed loosely over his midsection, and his thoughts no longer following a trail, but simply floating. The hours after midnight, he knew, were different from the rest, not heavier or lonelier, just looser, as if time itself had untied its belt and allowed the minutes to slip by barefoot. The walls around him no longer held warmth, but they didn't resist either. The stone had cooled into neutrality, neither inviting nor repelling, merely present, like an old companion who had nothing left to say but stayed anyway. The lantern had burned out with a final flicker some time ago, its smoke now a memory absorbed into the darkness, and Liang hadn't lit another. There was no need. The moonlight offered just enough visibility, and besides, this part of the night belonged to shadows. The room was filled with a kind of auditory hush, not silence exactly, but the deep quiet of sleeping earth, where even the wind moved with padded feet. Occasionally, there was a crack or pop from the stone or wood, the subtle contracting and expanding of old materials reacting to the chill. Outside, the world had gone soft. The outlines of hills were blurred by distance, and the trees stood like silent figures caught mid-step, unmoving in the bluish dark. The great wall stretched westward, its curves and rises dulled into gentle humps under the moonlight, as if the whole structure had grown tired of its own vigilance and chosen to exhale for a little while. Liang knew the sensation well, not exhaustion, but a gradual release of purpose, a softening of attention that came only when one was sure nothing was needed of them anymore, at least for now. In his corner of the chamber, he shifted his legs and reclined further, resting one arm behind his head. His eyes blinked slowly, not from fatigue, but because blinking felt like breathing for the eyes. His mind no longer reached for memories or sensations. It floated instead, like mist over a lake, touching the edges of thoughts without needing to define them. He might have considered the names of stars or the number of steps it took to walk the full perimeter of the tower, but he didn't. He might have recalled the story his father told him as a boy about a lone soldier who stood watch through winter without once lighting a fire, but he didn't. Instead, he felt the blankness of his mind, like fresh paper, unwritten, undemanding, complete in its own way, the kind of quiet where nothing presses inward and nothing presses out. He could hear his own breathing now, clearer than before, the slow in and out of his chest, rising beneath the weight of the robe. Even that rhythm felt less like an action and more like something the night did through him. He glanced once at the window slit, where a patch of sky still glimmered, and was reminded of water, how the stars shimmered like fish beneath the surface of a gently moving stream. That image pleased him, though it slipped from his mind as soon as it arrived, replaced not by another image, but by stillness. Somewhere far away, perhaps beyond the next range of hills, a wolf howled, not a long, mournful cry, but a short, muted note, more like a yawn than a song. Liang heard it and let it pass through him without reaction, a sound that belonged to the night as much as wind or the beating of one's own heart. Time passed, though not in any way he could measure. The ledger remained closed, the tools undisturbed. The signaling flag outside hung limp, unnoticed in the darkness. He thought, vaguely, that if a storm were to roll in from the north, the air would have changed by now. But there had been no such shift, no bite of cold, no scent of ozone, only the clean, dry smell of a stone and pine and old wood blending into the same comforting nothingness that surrounded everything else. Liang curled his fingers once, then let them relax. He tilted his head gently to the side and listened, not to anything in particular, but to everything all at once. The quiet footfalls of history, the steady beat of architecture, the breath of the sleeping world. And in that posture, in that hour, in that room suspended halfway between dream and duty, he found a rare stillness, not the kind one chases through silence or effort, but the kind that arrives when the body, the space, and the hour finally stop arguing with one another. He felt no tension in his limbs, no plans in his thoughts, no desire for the hour to become anything else. He was, in that moment, exactly where he was meant to be, unmoving, unneeded, perfectly awake, and deeply at rest. The great wall stretched beyond him, silent and vast, and the stars above flickered their gentle agreement. The hours between midnight and the edge of dawn always held a particular character at the watchtower, neither part of the day just past, nor yet belonging to the day ahead. This was the realm of the in-between, the hour when the world slept deeply enough for its secrets to stir. Liang remained still, though no longer reclining. He now sat upright once more, the cold stone pressing into his back, the robe wrapped tightly around his frame, like a cocoon of purpose and patience. The moon had shifted from its place of dominance, and its light no longer poured through the western slit with confidence, but rather traced soft curves along the edge of the floor, creeping toward the center of the chamber like a timid visitor. He watched the movement not because he expected change, but because watching itself had become his form of rest. In this hollow hour, his mind was not busy with memory or meaning. Instead, it listened to the tower, to its voice, to its slow internal shifting that only came alive when all else had grown silent. The beams groaned again, not loudly, but with the same ancient ache of something stretching after long stillness. The stone beneath Liang's body gave off no sound, but its presence was pronounced, like a deep, grounding breath that existed just beneath sensation. It was in this stillness that Liang could sense things he never did in daylight. The way the air cooled differently in the corners of the chamber compared to the window ledge, the faint pressure of night wind brushing against the far door but never quite entering, the almost imperceptible sound of dust settling on the far shelf. He didn't respond to these sensations outwardly, for the discipline of the watch was not only in movement, but in quiet acknowledgement. These small notes were not disruptions. They were the subtle communications of an ancient structure sharing its weariness and resilience. Liang took it all in, like one might listen to the breath of a sleeping loved one, steady, slow, and deserving of attention. He stood for a time, his movements so gradual they barely disturbed the air. A short walk across the stone floor, not to complete a task, but simply to shift the body's rhythm and keep the blood warm. His feet made the faintest contact with the ground, slippers muffling the sound to almost nothing. He moved to the doorway and leaned there, eyes adjusting to the deeper dark beyond. The walls, the world outside, had lost almost all definition, becoming a blend of shape and suggestion. Trees without leaves, ridgelines without peaks, shadows without source. Yet Liang knew what lay beyond. He could trace the contours of the path even without seeing it. He had memorized the dips and curves of the wall by feel and sound, by habit and heartbeat. The tower was a vessel, and he was its pulse, an awareness that moved through its length in cycles older than even his own service. A chill ran along his spine, not unpleasant, but a gentle reminder of time's slow march toward morning. Somewhere far to the east, beyond the black shape of the hills, the sky would be preparing to pale. Not yet, but soon. Liang remained at the threshold, breathing in the night's scent. The breeze had gathered a new tone, thinner now, as if it too were beginning to retreat, its work of cooling and carrying complete. Above, the stars continued their ancient rotation, less dazzling now as the first hints of atmospheric change touched the highest places. He closed his eyes and simply stood there, arms folded across his chest, letting the night press against him like a weighted blanket drawn over both tower and man. Inside again, he relit the lantern, not to dispel the dark, but as a quiet gesture of continuity. The glow returned reluctantly, its flicker unhurried, casting an amber sheen that mingled with the last threads of moonlight crawling along the far wall. He opened the ledger once more, not with the urgency of duty, but with the reverence of ceremony. The brush touched ink, then paper. His hand moved slowly, as if translating not words, but the breath of the hour. Night continues. The tower speaks. No movement beyond the walls. All remains. He paused, then added, stone breathes, wind thins, stars hold. These were not observations meant for record alone, but for companionship, for keeping the hour company as it passed quietly through his hands. He set the brush down and rested both palms against the table's worn surface, closing his eyes. Once again, the fire in the lamp crackled just faintly, echoing gently across the curved stone ceiling. He stayed like that for some time, standing, listening, waiting, not for an event, but for the sense that something wordless had completed its passage through the room. And when that moment came, when the air shifted and the quiet grew even deeper, he knew that night's longest stretch had passed. Not that he saw the light yet, but that the waiting had changed. The bones of the tower had quieted their song. The wind no longer asked questions, and Liang, eternal in posture, remained a figure of witness, not asleep, not speaking, but deeply present in a world that had decided to pause. Before the sky truly changed, before the first birds dared their opening notes, before even the clouds were sure of their shapes, there was a subtle shift, a lifting of the weight that night had pressed gently onto the earth. Liang noticed it not with his eyes, for the darkness remained nearly whole, but through the way the air felt on his skin, cooler now, yet lighter, as though the very molecules were loosening in preparation for the arrival of day. He sat quietly on the floor of the chamber, facing east, where a slit in the stone wall framed a narrow glimpse of sky just above the distant ridgeline. The stars were still visible, but fainter, like whispers at the end of a long conversation, and beyond them, just beyond, a suggestion of something softer than black, a wash of gray, barely distinguishable from the night, but undeniably present. This was the hour that did not belong to darkness or light, a breath held between the two, and Liang received it like a monk accepting a bowl of water, with silence, humility, and deep regard. The chamber, though unchanged in form, had begun to transform in feeling. The shadows, while still dominant, had grown porous at the edges, touched by the barest intrusion of suggestion. Liang's lantern had long since extinguished itself, its wick burned low, and its oil spent, but he had not relit it. The coming light would make such efforts unnecessary. His eyes, long adjusted to the depths of night, now caught the faintest silhouettes of the table, the shelves, the ledger resting untouched, outlined not by brightness, but by the mere absence of complete dark. He rose slowly, joints stiff, but not painful, and stretched his arms with the slow deliberateness of someone not in a hurry to change state, but simply acknowledging that a new one approached. He crossed to the eastern window and stood still, his breath warming the air just in front of the stone, only to be carried away again by the gentlest returning breeze. Outside, the landscape remained largely hidden, but the ridgeline had acquired shape, no longer the indistinct curve of midnight, but a soft contour now separating sky from hill. The trees far below remained in shadow, yet the tops of their branches whispered a readiness to be seen. Liang breathed deeply, drawing in the cool, neutral air that marked the transition hour. It carried no scent, no warmth, no movement, just presence, pure and undemanding. He let it fill his lungs without resistance, then exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last remnants of the night that had filled the chamber like water in a deep bowl. The wall stretched outward to the east and west, a line of darkness still, but now rimmed with the faintest promise of silver. This silver was not yet light. It was the idea of light, the soft memory of it returning to the world after a respectful absence. Behind him, the tower remained quiet, though every stone seemed to listen with him. The ceiling bore the same marks of soot and time, the same spider-thin cracks that had run across it for decades. And yet, as dawn approached, it all seemed to vibrate gently, not with movement, but with anticipation. Liang stepped back from the window and sat again near the low table, now just barely visible in the shifting tones of the room. He did not reach for the brush. The ledger did not need words yet. This was not the time for documentation, but for witnessing, the kind of hour that asked for attention without action, presence without response. He folded his hands in his lap and allowed his thoughts to dissolve, not out of effort, but because there was nothing more to hold. Far off, barely audible, came the first bird song, one note, then a pause, then another, as if even the birds doubted their timing. Liang tilted his head, acknowledging the sound with the softness of a smile, not formed on his lips, but in his breathing. More notes followed, scattered and irregular, and still the sky remained mostly gray, not bright, but layered. Now, gray upon paler gray, like the strokes of a wide brush, dragged lightly across parchment. Slowly, as if summoned by thought alone, the shape of a distant tree emerged, just its crown visible over the edge of the ridge, backlit now by a faint warmth that had not been there minutes before. This was the beginning in its most humble form, not sunrise, not yet, but the slow unfastening of darkness, stitch by stitch. Liang stood again, and this time he moved with a rhythm shaped by familiarity. He stepped to the water basin and dipped his fingers in, letting the chill bite gently into his skin before rubbing it across his face and neck. The gesture was not meant to wake him. He had not slept, but to welcome the return of the world's motion. He dried his hands on a cloth folded beside the basin and returned it precisely to its place. There was no hurry, no checklist. This was the rhythm of readiness that belonged to the keeper of the watch, the one who had seen the day arrive not with trumpets or fire, but with the hush of something too old to need introduction. He opened the ledger then, not because something had happened, but because the act itself was part of the unfolding. He dipped the brush, now without urgency, and recorded what he did not see, but knew was true. Light returns, hills take shape, sky breathes pale. He added, first bird song, stillness shifts, no disturbances. He paused before finishing with, I remain. Dawn approaches. He waited for the ink to dry, and then gently closed the book. Then, stepping once more toward the eastern window, Liang watched as the first true color crept across the distant clouds. Not red, not gold, but the barest shade of pink, like the blush of something that had once slept and was now, without drama, beginning to wake. The first genuine rays of sunlight arrived not with sudden brilliance, but with the hesitance of something ancient and wise returning after a long absence, knowing its place was assured and did not need to be rushed. Liang watched from the eastern slit in the wall as the light gently unwrapped the world, stone by stone, tree by tree, as though the landscape itself were being revealed by slow degrees from under an invisible cloth. The hills that had only moments ago been soft suggestions were now becoming themselves again, solid, detailed, rooted, and the wall, that ancient path of endurance, caught the sun along its upper ridges in gleams that looked like dew even though no water had touched them. Liang narrowed his eyes slightly against the new brightness, not in resistance but in reverence, the way one might squint at something too beautiful to take in all at once. He rested his hand on the stone ledge, now warming under the first touch of the sun, and allowed the sensation to settle into his fingers. A faint pulse of heat, the beginning of another long cycle. The tower itself, once dark and indistinct, was now reshaping within the growing light. In the growing light, the interior stones revealed their imperfections again. The cracks that ran like old veins through the mortar, the discolorations from smoke and use, the worn dips in the floor where feet had turned in the same patterns for generations. Liang found comfort in these details. They were not signs of weakness, but of continuity. The tower remembered every day it had endured, and in doing so, it helped him remember that endurance did not need to be loud or fast. As he turned from the window and moved toward the center of the chamber, his steps made soft contact with the warming floor, and the gentle brightness reached past his robe's edge and began painting faint gold across its folds. The air inside was still cool, but no longer the cool of night. It had become the early chill that invited movement, the kind that carried the quiet promise of warmth to come. Outside, the forest had found its color again, muted greens returning to the pine needles, soft browns to the trunks, and a bluish haze to the distant stream, now barely visible as it shimmered faintly in its winding course far below. Liang took a moment to observe a single bird flit across the opening, a small streak of gray and black that passed without pause, already engaged in its morning errands. It reminded him that life beyond the tower did not wait for permission to resume. It simply did. His own tasks for the day, though few and familiar, now beckoned with the same slow certainty. He moved to the supply shelf and checked the arrangement of tools, brushes, ropes, cloths, water gourds, each item in its place, each one touched briefly as if to confirm its readiness. No repairs were needed, no restocking, only the ritual of touch, a quiet inventory, not of objects, but of attention. He took a small meal from the wooden box stored in the shaded corner, just a folded bundle of rice, wrapped in dried leaf, firm and cool, and a strip of preserved root. He ate, standing near the window, not hurried, but with efficient bites, chewing slowly, eyes fixed outward as the light spread further across the landscape. More birds now, and from far off, the faint creak of a cartwheel, probably a patrol returning from a southern path, though still too distant to see. Liang listened without needing to identify it fully. It was enough to know the world was moving again. The quiet he had guarded through the night was shifting, still deep, still slow, but now pulsing with the early beat of day. After finishing his meal, he poured a small amount of water into a shallow dish and rinsed his fingers. The water felt warmer than it had before, slightly, subtly, and this too was a message. Morning had arrived. The silence of the night had not ended abruptly, but rather transitioned into a different kind of hush, one filled with movement rather than rest. Liang stepped to the center of the room and began the first physical task of the day, loosening the cloth rolls that covered the openings in the northern wall, allowing airflow and light to return to the corners of the tower. Where darkness had clung longest, the cloth fell away with a soft flutter, and the breeze that entered was fresh, stirred by new heat. He drew it in, feeling the sting of it against his cheeks, the subtle lifting of his energy in response. He did not smile, not outwardly, but inside there was a softness, a familiar reassurance that the tower had once again made it through the night, and so had he. The ledger remained closed on the table, its final lines from the pre-dawn hour sufficient for now. He would add more later, when the sun had fully taken its seat. In the sky, when the light was no longer golden, but clear, when the bird song no longer sounded like memory, but like habit. Liang stood quietly near the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, and looked out once more over the wall that stretched into the horizon, now clearly defined, its battlements catching the sun like teeth of stone smiling into the wind. He exhaled, not in relief, but in agreement. It was morning, fully, and though it resembled every other morning, and though nothing remarkable had passed in the night, that sameness was the very miracle of it. The tower had watched, Liang had remained, and the world, without noise or notice, had turned again. Now that morning had fully settled, and the golden light had surrendered to the clearer, flatter tones of daytime. The tower no longer stood in contrast to the darkness, but had blended once, again, into the wider fabric of the land, becoming part of the endless chain of ridges and stones that wound across the hills like a weathered thread sewn into the very shape of the earth. Liang, no longer resting, no longer preparing, had entered the quiet tempo of daytime maintenance, the kind of simple labor that did not require urgency or even full concentration, only repetition and attentiveness. He stepped outside the tower, briefly, his feet treading across the cold stone walkway that edged the wall's width, checking the integrity of the barrier to his right, the stone rails, the mortar lines, the base of the signal flagpole. Each passed under his gaze with the thoroughness of someone who knew the rhythm of their own station, like breath. He paused once near a low patch where moss had begun to form in a seam, and he knelt to gently clear it away, his fingers working softly, not to erase but to manage, to remind the moss that although it had found a home here, its welcome could only go so far. The wind up high was steady now, flowing in broad, predictable strokes from west to east, carrying with it the faint sense of early day life far below, wood smoke from a distant fire, perhaps, or the dry metallic tang of sun warming on tools, or the distant murmur of animals stirring where fences and fields met the forest. The world was awake now, and though the tower remained high and apart, it was still tied invisibly to all these movements below. Liang leaned into the wind briefly, letting it lift his sleeves and tug at the edge of his robe. Before stepping back inside, the light through the open windows had now fully claimed the room, illuminating not only its surfaces, but its history. Each mark, each groove in the table, each shadow cast not sharply, but diffused through centuries of use. He moved to the broom in the corner and began sweeping again, not for cleanliness, for the chamber was nearly spotless, but because the sweeping itself was part of the daily rhythm, the brush of straw across stone like a whispered song between the structure and its keeper. Each pass was deliberate, though unhurried, a gesture of care, repeated not for result, but for ritual. The dust he gathered was almost imaginary, a faint gray suggestion that clung to the bristles more out of obligation than necessity. Still, he swept the length of the floor, paused near the table to adjust a stool slightly, and then continued, finishing near the door with a final pull that left the surface bare and even. Afterward, he reached for the rolled parchment map kept near the shelf, unfurled it slowly, and laid it flat on the table's surface. The parchment held the traced paths of the wall's local region, each tower marked, each valley noted, each bend in the terrain named not for fame, but for orientation. Liang did not study the map with urgency. It was part of his morning assessment, a way to align his mind with the geography around him, a gentle reminder that his station, while still and quiet, was part of something wider and interconnected. He rested his finger on the symbol that marked his own post, and then traced slowly westward, imagining the faces and towers he could not see, but knew were mirroring his routine in kind. Perhaps at Tower 37, the keeper was boiling water now. Perhaps at Tower 39, someone was tightening a loose step. They would not speak to each other today, perhaps not even this month, but their movements were joined by intention, an unbroken chain of vigilance spread across mountains. Liang rolled the map again with care and returned it to its shelf. He then stepped once more to the open window and stood there, not for lookout this time, but to breathe. The sky was now pale and open, brushed lightly with clouds that moved slowly, casting wide, blurry shadows that drifted lazily across the hills. The sun had risen high enough that the eastern peaks had lost their golden glow and returned to the pale grays and greens of their daytime attire. Below, the river still twinkled occasionally when wind shifted its surface, but even that gleam seemed softer now, filtered through the lens of a day already underway. Liang felt no need to speak, no need to mark the hour aloud. The wall itself carried the sound of time better than any bell could, the breeze in its cracks, the rhythm of boots on patrol paths, the occasional creak of timber, all part of a language older than words. He returned to the center of the room and poured himself a small cup of water, sipping it slowly, savoring the temperature which matched the air, neither cold nor warm, just balanced. He let it wash his mouth, then swallowed and refilled the cup, placing it beside the ledger without comment. The brush waited, but not yet. There was no event to record. The present moment, so calm, so complete in its stillness, did not require narration. It was enough to be lived. Liang placed both palms on the edge of the table and leaned forward slightly, eyes closed, absorbing the quiet hum of the tower as it held its place in the morning. The wall, stretching on in both directions, was at peace. The valley below was beginning its work. The birds had quieted after their first songs, and Liang, grounded and still, became one more stone in the long, watching spine of the great wall, silent, steady, and whole. By the time the sun had risen to its highest point, the shadows inside the watchtower had shortened to slivers, retreating to the very edges of the stone walls, like obedient servants that knew their role was to wait until the afternoon returned them to their full length. The chamber was now filled with the kind of light that flattened all things, not harsh, but absolute, a brightness that did not ask for attention, but simply existed, equalizing every crack, corner, and surface into a state of gentle surrender. Liang stood near the central column, his robe sleeves rolled neatly past his wrists, one hand resting on a cloth he used to wipe down the table's wooden top. Though there was little to wipe, the wood, long accustomed to wear and weather, had been smoothed over time by many hands before his own. As he moved the cloth in slow, circular motions, he wasn't cleaning so much as participating in the quiet rhythm of midday. When the world outside went still, the birds tucked themselves beneath leaves, and even the insects, so vibrant in the morning, quieted into a droning hum that seemed more like a memory than a sound. The stillness of this hour was different from that of night, not heavy or wrapped in darkness, but light and open, like a pause in the center of a thought. Liang understood that this was when the tower felt most exposed, bathed in sun, without the cloak of shadow, its old stones warm to the touch, but without the intimacy they carried at dusk or dawn. He walked the perimeter once more, inspecting the wall's upper edge and checking for signs of wear. The stones beneath his sandals were warm now, but not yet hot. He could feel the sunlight on the back of his neck, not biting, just resting there with the confidence of something that had returned countless times before. He stopped briefly by the flagpole, letting his fingers tap its wooden base. Hollow, reassuring sound, and then looked outward toward the west, where the great wall continued like a fossilized river, curving gently over the terrain, as if even the land itself had grown used to its presence. Inside, he poured another measure of water from the clay jug and drank it standing near the window slit, watching how the sunlight touched the ridgeline below. It was in this hour that most movement ceased. No messengers were expected, no riders dispatched, no smoke signals raised. Even patrols along the wall were minimal now, as the heat discouraged activity and encouraged endurance by stillness. Liang knew this pattern as deeply as he knew the sound of his own breath. This was the time to conserve, not just energy, but attention. One did not strain to listen in midday. One allowed the silence to unfold, and within it, if something broke its surface, then, and only then, would one act. It was not laziness, nor distraction, but the practiced discipline of waiting with full presence. He sat down with his back to the coolest part of the chamber wall and allowed his spine to straighten naturally, not from posture, but from long habit. His hands rested on his knees, open, idle. His eyes did not close, but softened, their gaze not fixed on anything in particular. Across the room, the brush and ledger remained untouched. The map rolled neatly beside them, and the tools in their proper places. Nothing needed doing, and that too was part of the day's shape. Liang breathed through his nose, slow and measured, taking in the sense of sun-warmed stone, old ink, and faint dust. A swallow darted past the window, so fast it seemed to blink into and out of existence, leaving only a single feather's flutter to mark its passage. From the tower's vantage, the world seemed to breathe more slowly in midday. Far down in the valley, fields shimmered under the sun's gaze, their colors bleached out temporarily, only to return with fuller richness once the angle of light shifted. The mountains in the distance were motionless, blue-gray and unmoving, guardians of everything that had come and gone before. Liang allowed his thoughts to drift, but not in stories or memories. He didn't recall past days or imagine future ones. Instead, he let his awareness settle on the act of simply being inside a tower that had stood longer than any man he had known, being surrounded by stone shaped by forgotten hands, being warmed by a sun that neither punished nor rewarded, only shone. Eventually, he rose, more to stretch than to resume work, and walked once more to the window, where the breeze, still gentle, began to return. It stirred his robe slightly, and carried with it the scent of dry grass and the distant tang of pine. This, he knew, was the sign that the hour was preparing to shift, that the slow tilt of afternoon had begun, even if the shadows had not yet lengthened. He touched the window's stone frame once, with flat fingers, then drew them back, satisfied by its warmth and texture. Returning to the center of the room, he placed both palms once again on the table, not to write, but to ground himself, to mark the completion of another small segment of the day's unspoken ritual. Outside, the stones of the great wall glowed softly, not with the heat of drama or spectacle, but with the subdued certainty of something that had endured every version of midday for centuries. And Liang, faithful in his slowness, moved in step with it, not to mark history, not to be remembered, but simply to continue as the wall did in the quiet shape of its watchfulness. By the time the first true shadows began to lean again toward the eastern wall, subtle and long like brush strokes from a sleepy painter, the tower had already entered the quiet mood that always followed midday stillness, a shift not felt in the body so much as in the air, in the way sunlight no longer pressed downward with the same firmness, but instead slanted, softer now, as if remembering how to let go. Liang had noticed it even before the shapes on the floor changed direction. He had sensed it in the way the breeze stirred differently, less like a blanket and more like a ribbon sliding along the stone. The heat that had filled the tower like a slow breath was now ebbing, inch by inch, retreating from the stones and returning them to their familiar coolness. Liang stood by the window again, not out of duty, but because the shift called to him, not in words or instruction, but in the quiet way changes call to those who've trained themselves to listen. Below, the distant world had resumed motion, not hurried, but purposeful. From the terraced fields along the lower hills, faint lines of smoke began to curl upward, thin and almost translucent, their rise marked not by color, but by motion. Someone, somewhere, was cooking the evening's first pot of rice. Further down, a figure moved slowly beside a mule cart, its wheels creaking faintly, though the sound never reached the tower. It was enough to see. Liang followed the figure's path for a while until it vanished behind a fold of terrain. This was the time of day when the world stretched itself out again, when shadows grew long and familiar, routines unfolded without announcement. Patrols would begin again soon, although lightly, as the wall's rhythm did not demand alertness at all hours, only awareness, which was something softer, steadier, and more sustainable. Inside, Liang moved with the same sense of return. He took down one of the cloths used to cover the signal horn and examined it for wear, running his fingers along the stitched edge, checking for loosening threads. There were none. Still, he folded it anew and placed it back with care. He opened a small wooden box where spare flints were kept and counted them without voice. 1, 2, 3, 4, then replaced them and closed the lid softly. These were not tasks in response to problems. They were gestures of companionship between man and station, signs that each respected the other's presence and continuity. The tower, after all, had no clock. Time moved through it as quietly and inevitably as weather, and Liang, like all who had stood in his place before, read its passage not by hours, but by light, by air, by sound. He returned to the ledger and considered whether a note was required. The day had been so typical, so undisturbed, that it seemed almost disrespectful to reduce it to words. Still, he dipped the brush and wrote slowly across the parchment. Afternoon leans west. No movement along the ridge. Smoke in the valley. Wind light. The brush moved easily, the ink flowing like memory, and he paused before closing the book to consider whether more was needed. He added, stones cooling, wall remains. Then he dried the page with a slow wave of his hand and gently closed it, the soft thump of the cover touching the table, like the end of a sentence spoken too quietly to be heard. Stepping once more outside onto the narrow stone path that hugged the exterior of the tower, Liang looked out across the western horizon, where the hills were now golden-tipped, glowing in patches where the sun still found purchase. The trees below had darkened in tone, their shadows blending at the base into a single, continuous hush of green-black. A hawk circled far above, solitary and unhurried, its wings adjusting only slightly as it drifted with the thermals rising from the heated earth. Liang watched it without thought, allowing its path to trace across his vision like a brush on silk. There was no story to follow, no question to answer, only the act of seeing and allowing the act to complete itself in silence. He turned back inside as the wind picked up faintly, the kind of breeze that came before evening, not the cooling gust of nightfall, but the prelude, the exhale that signaled the sun had begun its slow retreat. He placed a hand briefly on the western wall as he passed, feeling the warmth still held within the stone, and then moved back to the central chamber, where the light now pooled in angled shapes across the floor. He did not disturb them. He sat just outside of their reach and let them move without interference, watching them inch forward as the minutes passed. The minutes passed, long and golden and stretched thin, like old memories. The tower had returned to its original rhythm, the slow, deep breath that had guided it through centuries of days like this. And Liang, sitting in his usual place, with his robe gathered around his knees and the ledger at rest, became once again part of the silence, not because there was nothing to do, but because doing had merged with being. The sun continued to lower, the shadows continued to lengthen, and the great wall, old and awake, continued to watch without needing to be seen. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, the tone of the light began to shift once again, growing warmer, more orange at its edges, as if the day were burning low, like a final stick of incense, its glow softer now, more fragile. Liang remained seated near the southern opening of the tower, where the sun's last efforts reached longest into the room. He did not rise to chase the light. He allowed it to find him, to paint across his sleeve, to slip slowly along the uneven lines of the stone wall beside him. This time of day was always quieter than even the deepest parts of night, for unlike midnight, which held the potential for sudden stirrings, for mystery and imagination, early evening brought only a gentle winding down. No suspense, no surprise, just a slow return to rest. The tower, too, began to fall silent in a different way. Its walls stopped warming and started to exhale, releasing the heat that had soaked into them all day, not with noise, but with a slow breath that could be felt on the skin if one stood close enough to the stone. Liang rose, though without urgency, stretching slowly, his joints adjusting to motion again after long stillness. He walked to the outer parapet once more and stood, arms folded lightly across his chest, eyes focused not on any one object, but on the entire sweep of the landscape before him. The hills to the west were gilded with the last slanting light, the trees casting long silhouettes that merged together like the seams of a gently folded robe. The wall itself glowed for just a moment more, its battlements lit in broken fragments of gold before falling into grays and browns again. He watched without needing to think, allowing the passage of time to unfold across the land like an old, slow scroll unrolling its final chapter for the day. Birds returned now, not in chorus, but in pairs and threes, gliding low over the forest below, some settling in hidden branches, others cutting briefly through the air before disappearing into shadow. From this height, the world seemed paused, not asleep yet, but slowing in every direction. Liang lowered his gaze to the valley floor, where lights began to flicker in the distance. They were not flames, not yet lanterns, but the first signs of preparation, movement that signaled people setting down tools, lighting fires, calling animals home. None of it could be heard from the tower, but he could feel the shift through, the pattern of motion, slower now, circular, repetitive, winding downward like a well-remembered ritual. He stepped back into the tower and let the cooler air greet him. It carried the scent of pine now more strongly, and a faint mineral dryness that often marked the close of sunny days. He opened the small drawer beneath the shelf and retrieved the thin cloth wrap that covered the evening ledger entries. The brush waited, and this time he took it up easily, the bristles still stained faintly from earlier ink. Dipping it lightly, he recorded in slow, measured strokes. Sun descending, shadows returning to full length, no signal fires seen. Hills silent. He paused, tapping the excess ink off the side of the stone well, then added, birds low, wind dry, heat leaving the stones. The act of writing seemed to complete something the air itself had begun, that this moment, so subtle and unremarkable, had indeed happened, and was worthy of being held in record. He allowed the ink to dry without rushing it, breathing steadily, the only sound in the room, the faint scratch of bristle against parchment and the breeze teasing the doorway curtain. As he finished, he replaced the brush, rewrapped the cloth, and placed it back into its drawer with the same deliberate motion as every evening before. There was no need for difference or improvisation. Repetition was not boredom, it was reverence. Each gesture made the space more whole. Liang turned and walked one last time to the eastern window, where the light had already left. The sky there was paling into blue-gray, and the first faint star had begun to shimmer, not brightly, but with the confidence of something that always returned. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on the frame, feeling the stone's surface now cool to the touch, no longer holding the sun's imprint, but preparing for the night's neutrality. Within the tower, the shapes of objects began to soften, blending with the shadows they cast. The tools, the shelf, the basin, all still visible, but now flattened, muted, as though waiting to be forgotten until morning. Liang sat again, this time not to reflect or observe, but simply to be still in the face of dimming light. He placed his hands on his knees and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to the quiet inside the tower, to the wind through the wall's joints, to the long, invisible stretch of silence that would carry him toward the coming darkness. And outside, the wall, the forest, and the hills listened too, each in their way, as another day settled into itself, complete not because of what had happened, but because nothing had disturbed its passage, as the last traces of sunlight fully vanished behind the farthest western ridge. The world around the watchtower dissolved into a collection of softened outlines and gentle murmurs. What light remained was not enough to illuminate, but only to suggest shapes of trees along the horizon, curves of the wall undulating like the spine of some sleeping stone dragon, and the watchtower itself now wrapped in a hushed glow that made it feel older, more distant, like a memory standing still in real time. Liang moved quietly inside the tower, his steps careful, not out of caution, but as part of the deepening quiet that asked for everything to be slower, less defined, and more considerate. The oil lamp had been prepared earlier in the day, and he now lit it with a steady hand, watching the wick catch and rise, the small flame blooming into its amber radiance, like the return of a single voice into an otherwise silent room. The glow cast uneven shapes across the stone walls, bending slightly as the flame fluttered in the gentle air that crept through the open slits in the tower. Outside, the wind had become a more constant companion, not forceful, but present, weaving through the parapets and across the stones with a soft, repetitive song that Liang had known for years. It was the sound of night claiming its place, of the world unwinding its colors and trading them for tones of silver and shadow. He stepped once to the window, the lamp's light following him like a loyal pet, and looked out toward the wall, where its path vanished into darkness. The sky above had filled with stars in scattered layers, some bright, some faint, all seemingly more distant now than they had been in his youth. A thin crescent moon had begun its climb, low and quiet, as though it too knew. This part of the day was not for spectacle, but for subtle reminders that the universe was still turning. Liang pulled the curtain slightly across the doorway, not to block the air, but to signal to the space itself that the time of rest had begun. He moved with a rhythm shaped by familiarity, reaching for the woolen blanket folded neatly in the storage shelf and draping it across the sleeping mat placed beside the wall's warmest section. Though the stones had already cooled, they still retained the sense of having once held heat, which was comfort enough. He sat down slowly, legs crossed beneath him, and took a final drink of water from the small clay cup beside the lamp. The temperature had dropped, not drastically, but enough to signal the body that it should draw inward, conserve, and lean into stillness. There was nothing left to do for the day. No final message, no patrol report, no urgent concern. The ledger lay closed, its pages breathing quietly, holding within them the record of a day that had passed without conflict or interruption. And yet, it had been full, not of events, but of presences. The presence of light as it moved through the stone chamber, the presence of wind and heat and small unseen creatures rustling in grass far below, the presence of a tower that had done its task simply by standing, and of a man who had kept it company, not with noise or ambition, but with attention and care. Liang leaned his head back slightly against the wall and let his eyelids lower, not fully closed, not yet, but heavy with the knowledge that sleep would come without being summoned. The shadows in the room had emerged now into a single quietness, interrupted only by the flickering flame's soft breath and the occasional creak of a timber adjusting to the cool. The night outside deepened, and with it came the familiar sensations that no longer startled him. The distant howl of wind brushing across the wall's curves, the faint echo of something shifting in the forest below, and the sound of his own breath, moving slowly, steadily, like a clock wound by the stars. He let these sounds wash over him, not analyzing, not naming, only receiving. The tower, too, breathed in this silence, its long bones creaking faintly, not in protest, but in agreement. This was what it was built for. Not glory, not conflict, but watchfulness, patience, and the grace of endurance. Liang adjusted the blanket slightly, not in preparation for deep sleep yet, but simply to mark the final transition from day to night. There was no rush to lie down. The hours ahead would move slowly, just as he would. The lamp would burn for a while, casting its gentle circles of gold on the walls, then fade when it was ready, and he would rest when his breath aligned completely with the stillness. This hour, this quiet, golden hour of final light and first darkness, was not to be filled. It was to be witnessed. So he sat, wrapped in warmth and shadow, in a room that had held hundreds of such nights before, and would hold hundreds more after, with or without him, and outside, the great wall disappeared fully into the night, no longer visible, but still present, watching, waiting, enduring, while the stars moved overhead like slow, patient thoughts across the sleeping face of the world. By the time the lamp had burned itself down to a faint orange wick, flickering only when the breeze sighed through the narrow window slits, the tower had given itself fully to the night. not just in shadow, but in feeling, in the sense of being held in something vast and old, where the silence was no longer the absence of sound, but a full presence of stillness. Liang lay on his side now, wrapped in the coarse but comforting wool of his blanket, eyes barely open, watching the last embers of light cast trembling reflections against the lower wall, the shapes dancing for no audience but his own quiet breath. Sleep was near, not yet upon him, but walking its slow, patient circles, closer with every heartbeat. The tower did not ask him to stay awake forever. It never had. It asked only that he remain present long enough for the silence to pass gently from one guardian to the next. Sometimes the moon, sometimes the stars, sometimes nothing but the air itself. And that when sleep did come, it would do so not with resistance, but with ease. The room had cooled, not cold, but dense with the kind of air that made sound travel differently, thicker, slower, like words spoken in a dream. The stones under the sleeping mat were cold now, but predictably so, as they had been every night before. Liang curled slightly tighter beneath his blanket, one hand tucked under the edge of the mat, the other resting against the floor, touching it as though to confirm its reality one last time before letting go. Outside, the forest was still. No calls of birds, no rustling of deer, only the wind moving like a long breath across the tops of trees and through the narrow watch gaps in the wall's face. That sound, a soft, low moan that came and went without rhythm, had become more familiar to him than his own voice. It was the voice of the wall itself, whispering stories older than the empire, stories made of stone and cold and time. The sky beyond the tower was filled now, not with color, but with depth, black and blue and endless, dotted with stars that held their places like quiet guardians of the sky. Liang imagined the other towers in the distance, unseen now, but no less real, each with its own quiet room, its own blanket and cup and mat, its own keeper, perhaps already dreaming or still looking upward through a crack in the stone, wondering whether the stars had shifted. The great wall itself, vast and curved, continued its silent sprawl across valleys, rivers, and ridges, not as something built merely to keep others out, but as something that reminded those within of the persistence of quiet duty. It did not glow, did not speak, did not demand attention. It simply endured, one stone beside another, one watch after another, a long, sleeping body of vigilance under the stars. Liang closed his eyes fully now, not abruptly, but like a curtain slowly being drawn across the final act of a play. He listened one last time, not for danger, not for change, but for the shape of the silence itself. It was whole. The birds had settled. The wind no longer argued. The stars remained. He could still feel the faint echo of his heartbeat in his ears, but even that began to slow, to fade, to drift toward the gentle rhythm of dreams. His breath deepened, steady, silent. The tower seemed to lean with him, not physically, but in presence, as if it, too, recognized the shift from day into rest, from vigilance into peace. There was no need to mark the moment, no words to be written, no ceremony, only sleep, natural and undisturbed. The lamp gave one last flutter of flame, before dying quietly. The room now held only by starlight, by wind, by the memory of day. Liang did not feel it go out. He had already passed into the soft gray of dreaming, where time no longer followed rules, and the watchtower stretched and folded in strange ways, echoing with footsteps long gone and voices that might never have spoken. In this space, he was not alone, but joined by every watcher who had come before, every silent guardian who had leaned against the same stones, written in the same ledger, stared out at the same hills. They were not ghosts, they were echoes, warmth, presence. The wall remembered them all, and so the night deepened, fully and without noise, cradling the watchtower in its timeless arms, as stars moved across the sky with their ancient patience, and the great wall of China slept, stone by stone, tower by tower, breath by breath, holding its place, as it always had, under the endless watch of the quiet, eternal dark.